If someone had asked me in 1970, Lindsey Williams, do you believe there's a group of people on the face of the earth who control the world? I would have said, not only do I believe it, I would have said in 1970, I would have said, who are you, a John Bircher? If someone had asked me in 1980, Lindsey Williams, do you believe there's a group of people on the face of the earth who tell the president what to do, who tell the Arabs what they're going to give them for a barrel of oil, who dictate to the world what they should do? I would have said, not only do I believe it, I sat and listened to them talk about it. For 3 years' time, strictly by the problem. Here I was, an unknown little aviation missionary. Nobody knew who Lindsey Williams was. Back out in the bush country of Alaska, and all of a sudden had an opportunity to sit with the people that you only read about. I remember one night, I've been around them all day long. I couldn't believe there were such human beings on the face of the earth. I remember I went back to my dorm room, utterly exasperated at what I had seen and heard that day. I laid down on my bed in utter frustration, looked up at the ceiling and literally cried out to God. And I said, God, how can there be such dastardly people on the face of the earth that literally control the world? Folks, there are people who control the world. They have an agenda. They know what they are doing. How do I know? I was there. I lived with them for 3 years' time. I sat in their board meetings and heard what they had to say. My book, The Energy Non-Crisis, and I've written 6 books, by the way, have 2 of them here with me tonight. My books, all of them, including this one, my first one, The Energy Non-Crisis, are different than any other books you'll ever read. The reason they're different is because I did not research someone else's materials in order to write these books. These books are what I lived. First-hand stories of the people that I rubbed shoulders with. Ones that I knew them by first name, and I was considered to be their chaplain and minister. The power controllers of the world, and I write from first-hand experience. I lived my story. Well, finally, after about 2 years of this, I decided no one's ever going to believe a little missionary like me. If I ever decide to tell this story, no one would pay any attention to it. After all, how do they know I'm telling the truth? So I contacted a gentleman of great prestige, a man that I knew anyone would trust what he had to say. He writes the foreword to my book, The Energy Non-Crisis. His name is Senator Hugh Chance from the state of Colorado. And I said, Hugh, I'd like you to come to Prudhoe Bay and spend a week with me. I'll make all the arrangements with the oil company officials for you to see, talk with, have interviews with, anyone you'd like. He took me up on my offer. I made all the arrangements. He came to Prudhoe Bay. He spent 1 week with me. He interviewed every oil company official he wanted, from the senior executive with Atlantic Richfield down to BP oil company officials. And anyone that he wanted to talk with, they gladly gave him an interview. I will never forget what he said the day before he left. He said, Lindsey, you'll find it recorded, by the way, in my book, The Energy Non-Crisis. Senator Hugh Chance. I had to have a reputable person to see what I was seeing, or how would the world ever believe what I was going to say? He said, Lindsey, I was sitting in the Senate of the state of Colorado when the men came from Washington, D.C. to brief us as state senators as to the energy crisis. He said, Lindsey, from what I have seen here this week, from the mock-ups of the field, from the documentation, from the people I've talked with, I've come to realize that almost everything that I was told in that top-level briefing in the Senate of Colorado by the men from Washington, D.C., that almost everything I was told was the exact opposite of what the truth really is. He said I was intentionally misbriefed and I was lied to. Later, when I wrote the manuscript to my book, The Energy Non-Crisis, I asked him to write the foreword to the book. He did. You'll find it recorded here with his name on it. I'll never forget that day. It was 1976. I walked over to Arco Base Camp one morning, and as I walked in the front door, there was standing a gentleman by the name of Jim Lawler. He was the equipments man for Atlantic Ridge Field. And I said, "Jim, what's going on today?" He said, "Well, Chaplain, would you like to really see something exciting?" I said, "Well, Jim, I'm always in for excitement. What do you mean?" He said, "Come on, hop in the pickup truck and let's go out to West Dock." He said, I'd like you to see what we think we have struck today." And I said, "Jim, what's that?" And as we rode along, he tried to explain that little island out in the Arctic Ocean, about 2.5 miles out from the West Dock at Prudhoe Bay, where the big flotilla came in every year. He said, "Chaplain, we think we have just struck the largest pool of oil in North America and maybe the largest pool of oil in the world. Today we're going to release some oil, check the chemical analysis, the pressure of the field. We already know the size of the field." And he said the depth, and he went on to explain all the technical details that an oil man could. And when we arrived at the West Dock, we sat there for a few moments, and all of a sudden, a big black plume of smoke went up into the sky. That was back in the days when they still let them burn it off at Prudhoe. And after he watched it for a few moments, he said, "Come on, Chaplain, get in the truck. We got to head back to Arco Base. I want to see what's coming in from out at the well site." I'll never forget that day. And when you hear, as Paul Harvey says, the rest of the story, you'll know why gasoline could be $1.50 a gallon at the gas pump within 1 year's time if only the administration in Washington, D.C. would be willing to tell the American people the truth. We arrived back at base camp. Standing around the desk in Mr. Ken Fromm's office on the second floor of Arco Base was the top 8 oil company men of the world. I arrived with Jim Lawler at the door, and Ken Fromm, senior executive with Atlantic Ridge Field, said to me, "Come on in, Chaplain." And they closed the door. And there I stood that day with men that I never knew I'd rub shoulders with. Here I am, a simple missionary, aviation missionary out in the bush of Alaska, and all of a sudden I'm standing in the room watching the proof of the largest oil pool in North America and probably the largest oil pool in the world. Approximately, if I remember correctly, 8 men standing around that table looking at the mock-up of the field, looking at the perforations of the pipe, explaining all the details. I was invited in the room, and Mr. Ken Fromm, after a few moments of excitement, and I have never seen such excited oil men in all my life. They were almost beside themselves. And finally, Ken Fromm looked over at me, and he said, "Chaplain, we have just done it." I said, "Ken, you've just done what?" He said, "We have just struck the largest pool of oil in North America. It should be headlines on every newspaper in America tomorrow morning. America Energy Independent. We don't need any more foreign oil. We can supply from our own soil." He said, "We have everything we need." He said, "Chaplain, this is the most amazing find we've ever discovered in America." You can imagine that night I went back to my dorm room. First thing I wanted to do the next morning was get up and see the headlines on the Anchorage newspaper that came in on Wien Airlines' first flight to Prudhoe Bay. I rushed back over to Arco Base that morning to have breakfast, and I'd hardly walked in the door good, and the security guard caught me and said, "Chaplain, don't you say a word to anybody. You go right straight upstairs and sit down in Mr. Ken Fromm's office." I said, "Well, what have I done wrong?" He said, don't you even talk to me. He said, "You go up there and sit down. I got orders to catch you as soon as you come in." I walked in Ken Fromm's office, sat down. A few moments he walked in, closed the door, sat down across the desk without a smile on his face, and looked up at me and he said, "Chaplain, if I were you, I'd be a little careful about what you saw on yesterday and what you say." Because he said, "You see, that information about that oil pool out at Gull Island and the Gull Island field has just been classified." He said there will be no oil released from it anytime soon.